It is day 27 of the US-Iran war. The night sky over the Middle East is filled with multi-million-dollar interceptors chasing cheap incoming fire. This dashboard tracks the coalition's expenditure, and the math is bleak. In just the first 16 days of this conflict, US and allied forces have burned through $26 billion, expending over 11,000 munitions. The daily attrition rate plotted here shows exactly why that number is climbing so fast. Iranian forces are sustaining a relentless average of 33 ballistic missile and 94 drone attacks every single day. To counter this barrage, the United States is rapidly draining its finite stockpile of highly advanced PAC-3 interceptors and THAAD systems. The United States is locked in a math problem it cannot win. Iran studied 2 decades of American military entanglements and deployed a specific strategic doctrine. They intend to beat the US simply by not losing, bleeding American defense stockpiles dry through a prolonged war of attrition. The sheer scale of this conflict suggests an immediate existential crisis forced America's hand. Yet, prior to the first strikes, the internal assessment from the US intelligence community was unanimous. Iran was not on the cusp of making a bomb, and there was no imminent threat. Leaders at the highest levels of the intelligence apparatus, including the Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center, the government's primary organization for integrating terrorism intelligence, explicitly advised that preemptive strikes led necessary. This internal assessment rested on continuous observation, noting that Iran possessed neither the capability for a sudden nuclear sprint nor the intent, adhering to a 2004 fatwa, or religious decree issued by the Ayatollah, that explicitly forbade the development of nuclear weapons. We did not stumble into this war because of blind spots in our intelligence gathering. The United States military apparatus was systematically hijacked by a foreign ally, whose deliberate influence campaign bypassed the intelligence process entirely to manufacture a conflict. American foreign policy regarding Iran has historically relied on 2 pillars: containing any potential nuclear capability and utilizing severe economic sanctions to maintain leverage over the regime. This split-screen matrix visualizes the stark divide between American and Israeli objectives. While the US focuses on containment, Israel views Iran as an existential threat and pursues total regime change through direct military force. Israel lacks the size and unilateral capability to permanently dismantle a massive, well-defended nation like Iran on its own. To achieve its strategic goal, it requires the full commitment of the United States military. Furthermore, the Israeli risk profile accommodates regional destabilization. They are willing to accept widespread chaos as a necessary byproduct of toppling the regime, an outcome the United States traditionally spends billions to avoid. To execute a localized objective that America did not share, Israeli officials had to find a way to align the overwhelming force of the US military against its own vital national security interests. The mechanism for forcing that alignment required rewriting the rules of engagement. Under the previous US executive policy, the established red line for military action was clear: Iran could not possess a fully constructed nuclear weapon. Based on that shared understanding, US diplomats were actively succeeding in negotiations with Tehran. A historic deal was within sight, which paradoxically presented a massive threat to the Israeli goal of a military-driven regime change. To short-circuit these negotiations, foreign liaisons exhumed a specific 2018 diplomatic talking point from former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo regarding uranium enrichment levels and began aggressively weaponizing it. As shown in this sliding scale, Israeli intelligence and defense officials effectively moved the American red line. Through repetitive engagements, they successfully equated any degree of uranium enrichment, a standard component of civilian nuclear power, with the immediate possession of a nuclear bomb. This new standard ignored physical reality. Even with existing enrichment capabilities, building a functional weapon and delivery system takes months to years, making the heavily promoted narrative of a 2-week breakout an engineering impossibility. By artificially moving the goalpost and redefining the terms of engagement, foreign influence networks manufactured an imminent nuclear threat out of thin air, forcing an immediate military response. This flowchart outlines the standard process designed to protect US interests. Raw intelligence is gathered, formalized into an assessment by the intelligence community, vetted through the National Security Council, and presented for presidential action. But look at the secondary path that emerged. Foreign liaisons bypassed the intelligence vetting entirely, injecting the new enrichment equals bomb narrative directly into powerful political donor networks and lobbying groups. This foreign policy objective was then laundered through a tightly coordinated media echo chamber. News networks relentlessly amplified the false threat, transforming a foreign strategic goal into a domestic political talking point. Key domestic politicians actively provided legislative legitimacy to the panic, loudly demanding military intervention based on a fabricated timeline. The result was a closed loop. The executive branch was surrounded by an ecosystem of media pundits and wealthy donors, repeating the exact same foreign objective, completely drowning out the sober, factual assessments coming from its own intelligence agencies. The United States intelligence apparatus did not fail to predict a threat. It was systematically circumvented by a synchronized lobbying and media campaign designed to trigger a war. The immediate result of this pressure was Midnight Hammer, a series of tactical U.S. strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear sites, executed as a compromise to satisfy the manufactured threat without committing to a full-scale invasion. Obliterating the enrichment facilities did not satisfy the foreign intelligence network because surgical strikes do not achieve their true objective, total regime change. The strikes did, however, trigger Iran's long-term strategic preparations. Having watched the United States bleed its resources in Iraq and Afghanistan for over 2 decades, Tehran knew exactly how to respond. They absorbed the initial loss of air dominance and activated a relentless, low-cost retaliatory barrage, utilizing an extensive inventory of ballistic missiles and drone swarms to test American endurance. By ceding its policy decisions to an external power, the United States entered a flawed military engagement, where the adversary dictates the pace of attrition, draining American strength one costly interceptor at a time. Now, the same influence networks that manufactured the air war are pushing for a catastrophic escalation, deploying U.S. ground troops to secure strategic Iranian assets. The primary target currently being floated for a marine landing is the Karg Island oil terminal, a massive piece of infrastructure located in the highly volatile Strait of Hormuz. From a tactical perspective, capturing this territory is exactly what the enemy wants. If American Marines and paratroopers secure a beachhead, they instantly transform from an expeditionary force into static, deeply vulnerable hostages. Any occupying force on Karg Island would be immediately encircled by a lethal combination of pre-sighted ballistic missiles, dense sea mines, and continuous drone swarms launched from the Iranian mainland. This specific escalation perfectly fulfills the allied nation's underlying objective. Once American troops are taking casualties on the ground, the political pressure to double down guarantees a prolonged, inescapable commitment to a regime change war. Committing ground troops would instantly devolve an already expensive air campaign into a deadly, unwinnable land quagmire, repeating the exact mistakes of the last 20 years. The fallout extends far beyond the battlefield. This data visualization maps the projected global oil supply disruptions if the Strait of Hormuz is contested, predicting an economic shock that eclipses the combined energy crises of the 1970s. The geopolitical damage is already visible. The United States is rapidly alienating host nations in the Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, a political and economic alliance of Middle Eastern states. Airports and critical infrastructure in places like Qatar and Kuwait are currently under fire simply because they house American military bases. There is no military solution to a math problem designed to bleed you dry. The United States must definitively sever the policy subversion circuit that engineered this crisis in the first place. This requires 2 immediate actions. First, the executive branch must restrict its military umbrella, refusing to support or supply offensive capabilities to any allied nation attempting to dictate American involvement. Second, it must restore the internal assessments of its own intelligence agencies over the speculative narratives generated by external media and lobbying networks. The only viable exit from this manufactured quagmire is an immediate return to independent diplomacy. American foreign policy must align strictly with American national security interests, not the existential ambitions of a foreign power.